Our moon is unique. Its gravitational influence keeps the Earth's orbit regular, meaning our planet's climate is stable. Its cratered surface preserves an important record of the solar system's history, a history that weather and tectonic forces have erased from the Earth's surface. In the 1970s, with the last Apollo moon landings, everyone expected that new missions would follow the preliminary lunar investigations. The idea that 50 years would pass without further lunar exploration was unthinkable. NASA had plans for a lunar base and an orbiting space station, and ideas about mining lunar resources had also been mooted. Instead, the space shuttle was developed as a way to cut costs, but it meant manned activity would be confined to low Earth orbit. Eventually, a space station was completed, but only when the international community was persuaded to join the project and share the cost. Exploration of deep space became the preserve of robotic missions. But safety issues meant the space shuttle was withdrawn from service prematurely. The long lead times in developing a replacement meant that the American Space Agency was left flat-footed. NASA finally decided that private industry could take over trips to low Earth orbit, with the agency shifting its focus to manned exploration of deep space. While NASA had ambitious plans to return to the moon, Washington was slow in releasing funds. NASA had been developing a human-rated spacecraft called Orion, along with a new Ares launch vehicle. This was the Constellation program, tailored for ambitious missions beyond Earth orbit.
3, 2, 1.
Ares flew once, but serious problems led to its demise. Orion was reconfigured, and the European Space Agency was asked to join the project and design an accompanying service module in an attempt to reduce costs. In 2014, Orion was ready for unmanned flight testing, and temporarily a commercial launch vehicle would replace the Ares. The mission, known as Exploration Flight Test 1, featured a dummy service module and an incomplete launch escape system. It was carried atop a Delta IV heavy launcher.
1. And liftoff at dawn. The dawn of Orion and a new era of American space exploration.
The flight was needed to test the craft's re-entry capability. After 6 minutes, the launch abort system was jettisoned. The spacecraft was boosted to an extremely high apogee of 5,800 kilometers, so that its re-entry velocity was similar to what it would experience returning from the moon. After a 4.5-hour flight, the Orion capsule was floating in the Pacific Ocean, where a team from the USS Anchorage recovered the craft for detailed analysis. The mission was a success. But in 2014, the only real plan was for the craft to be used in conjunction with an asteroid retrieval mission, which was soon dumped. It has been waiting for the Space Launch System. The U.S. budget authorization bill signed in 2010 allotted money for the big new rocket, but the primary reason politicians had approved it was to appease various branches of the space industry and to preserve jobs. Washington made funds available with preconditions. Corporations that had supplied components for the space shuttle should supply components for the Space Launch System. Utah Senator Orrin Hatch wanted the big new rocket to use solid-fueled boosters, like the shuttle, because they were built and tested in Utah. Senators from Alabama and Florida knew that upgrades to existing shuttle facilities would see dollars continuing to flow into their states. The SLS is described as a shuttle-derived vehicle. It is fitted with upgraded versions of the shuttle's RS-25 engines, and the core stage draws heavily on the shuttle's external tank. The design directives were justified as giving NASA a launcher grounded in mature technology. But critics argued that the expense would mean slow development and at best 2 launches per year. Rather than deliver mature technology, it was saddling NASA with an outmoded system. And while NASA had plans for the Space Launch System, its development costs meant the agency had no funds to do much except build the launcher. It was a big rocket with nowhere to go. In 2017, President Trump threw NASA a lifeline when he signed the White House Space Policy Directive 1.
The directive I'm signing today will refocus America's space program on human exploration and discovery. It marks an important step in returning American astronauts to the moon for the first time since 1972 for long-term exploration and use. This time, we will not only plant our flag and leave our footprint, we will establish a foundation for an eventual mission to Mars, and perhaps someday to many worlds beyond.
There was no new money associated with the directive, but NASA ran with the idea and soon came up with the Artemis program.
What many people don't know is that Apollo had a twin.
She was a woman named Artemis,
goddess of the moon.
We are returning to the moon.
as a new generation of explorers.
This time to stay.
And to prepare to achieve humanity's next giant leap of sending the first human missions to Mars.
We believe our course will redefine what is possible.
That we would discover life-saving,
earth-changing science.
And that the challenges ahead will inspire generations.
This is our manifest.
For all who wondered if we could return.
For all who dreamed of pressing beyond.
This is your calling.
We go for all of America.
We go.
We go as the Artemis generation.
We go.
The NASA administrator at the time, Jim Bridenstine, knew he had to get the public on side. At a meeting with NASA staff, he was candid about the difficulties in realizing the directive.
I don't think anybody can take this level of commitment seriously unless there are additional means. And so that's what I intend to support as we go forward. It is also my commitment to make sure people understand the history here and that we can have a great, ambitious goal, but without the resources, it won't be accomplished.
A detailed plan emerged. A new space station, the Gateway, positioned in a highly eccentric lunar orbit, would serve as a transfer point for astronauts traveling to the moon's surface. The eccentric orbit would make it easy to reach almost any point on the lunar surface, and it would give NASA experience operating in deep space, necessary for long-term excursions to Mars. Because the directive encouraged collaboration with private industry, NASA began asking for concepts for various parts of the Lunar Gateway and for a lunar landing system. The agency was aiming for a landing in 2028. Early in 2019, the deadline shifted. U.S. Vice President Mike Pence made a speech at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama.
It is the stated policy of this administration and the United States of America to return American astronauts to the moon within the next 5 years. In order to succeed, as the administrator will discuss today, we must focus on the mission over the means. You must consider every available option and platform to meet our goals, including industry, government, and the entire American space enterprise.
The vice president even invoked the spirit of the Cold War.
Now, make no mistake about it. We're in a space race today, just as we were in the 1960s. And the stakes are even higher. Last December, China became the first nation to land on the far side of the moon and revealed their ambition to seize the lunar strategic high ground and become the world's preeminent spacefaring nation. And for more than 7 years, without a viable human space launch program of our own, Russia has been charging the United States more than $80 million a seat every time an American astronaut travels to the International Space Station.
Even at the following public meeting of the National Space Council, the vice president gave no detail about funding or how NASA could meet the technical challenge. Just pressure to conform to a new, capriciously imposed timeline. It's important to understand the atmosphere existing in the 1960s when President John Kennedy laid down a deadline for the Apollo program. The Soviet Union had been making rapid scientific advances. With the detonation of the country's first atomic bomb in 1949, it matched the United States as a nuclear superpower. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first satellite. Cold War paranoia swept the United States. American leaders, seeing the communist nation pull ahead in space research, demanded a quick response. In 1958, the Eisenhower administration established NASA, which recruited test pilots as their first 7 astronauts. Congress delivered the funding for America's new thrust to space. They understood the urgency and swiftly authorized the expenditure. However, in April 1961, the Soviets continued to press their advantage. Colonel Yuri Gagarin became the first cosmonaut. His spacecraft, Vostok 1, orbited the Earth once, and he returned safely to the ground, triggering a new wave of American humiliation. Three weeks later, NASA responded. The Redstone rocket that carried Alan Shepard did not have enough power to reach orbit. His capsule was named Freedom 7 in the spirit of the Cold War.
3, 2,
Shepard made a 15-minute space hop, but everyone knew it was a poor second to Gagarin's orbital flight. Experts at NASA helped the new President John Kennedy understand that while the Soviets had an early lead in heavy lift rockets, the US could outspend the Russians in achieving an ambitious goal, if it was beyond the current capabilities of the Soviet rocket program. In May 1961, Kennedy delivered a special message to Congress.
I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space. None will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
NASA, just 3 years old at the time, was delighted, although there was surprise that such an ambitious target had been set just weeks after Alan Shepard's 15-minute flight. But the American people were behind Kennedy's idea, and so were the legislators. At the time, NASA was led by James Webb, a canny administrator who understood that most of his work would be in lobbying politicians to make sure that funds continued to flow for what became known as the Apollo program. Throughout the Mercury program and the following Gemini program, Webb made sure that the astronauts were treated as national heroes, and that political leaders could bask in their reflected glory and continue to fund the huge enterprise. Under Webb's leadership, infrastructure that NASA still relies upon today was built. and the disparate group of research centers that had been combined to form NASA coalesced into a unified entity. The injection of funds into the high-tech area of the U.S. economy changed the world's industrial landscape with spin-offs we still benefit from today. Despite President Kennedy's assassination and many developmental difficulties, the first moon landing happened in July 1969.
9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
The deadline was met, and America began losing interest. Apollos 18, 19, and 20 were canceled as government began refocusing on its budget. Work on the Space Launch System continued at its modest pace. NASA crunched the numbers and said the accelerated program would need an additional $35 billion. This was not forthcoming. Next, NASA announced that the Lunar Gateway would no longer be necessary for the 2024 landing, and asked corporations to develop concepts for a lunar lander. Early in 2020, Dynetics, SpaceX, and a team led by Blue Origin all received varying amounts of seed money for initial design work on a human landing system. This was important because NASA was introducing the private sector to their lunar program in the way Boeing and SpaceX were used for the development of services to the ISS. With the change in the U.S. administration early in 2021, many at the space agency were worried that the Artemis program, like many before it, would not survive the political transition.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
When Bill Nelson was nominated as NASA's new administrator, reactions were mixed. While a serving congressman, he had flown as a mission specialist on Space Shuttle Columbia for the deployment of the SATCOM K-1 communications satellite. Nelson is enthusiastic about the Artemis program, but he favors building the Space Launch System through traditional cost-plus contracting methods, which are proving to be time-consuming and expensive. Comparisons with the new directions being taken by corporations like SpaceX are compelling. The company completed its development and flight testing of the Crew Dragon 2 system in 2020 and has since ferried astronauts to and from the International Space Station. Boeing, a company accustomed to working with NASA using conventional methods, was commissioned to develop a parallel system. Their Starliner is more expensive than the Dragon, yet its development suffered many setbacks and it was years behind the Dragon. The key to understanding how SpaceX works is in not understanding the conventional approach to rocket building. The company has invested time and money in developing a Falcon 9 first stage that can safely return to the ground and be reused. The guiding hand behind SpaceX, Elon Musk, has often declared that the ambitious space missions of the future can only happen if the cost of access to space is drastically reduced, and that expendable rockets are an extravagance that can no longer be afforded. Since 2017, reuse of the Falcon 9 booster has become routine, allowing SpaceX to drastically undercut its commercial rivals in the launch business.
Stage 1 is transonic. Planning for startup.
The competition has been slow to react, with the Europeans seeking government subsidies and United Launch Alliance beginning its own development program. Even greater savings were made with the introduction of the Falcon Heavy, which is essentially 3 Falcon 9s strapped together. Its twin boosters land in formation. Originally, SpaceX had intended that the Falcon 9's upper stage would return to the ground as well, but it was soon realized that the design could not be stretched that far. A completely new concept emerged. At 118 meters, SpaceX's Starship is huge, and it's designed to be completely reusable. It has 2 stages. The first stage, known as the Super Heavy, will return to the ground in similar fashion to the Falcon 9's first stage, while the upper stage, the Starship, will plunge back through the atmosphere belly first. The new system has a new engine called the Raptor, which itself is revolutionary. Most first-stage engines use flight-grade kerosene as fuel, with liquid oxygen as the oxidizer. The Raptor uses methane, which has big advantages for reliability and reusability. Both stages will be fitted with varying numbers of the Raptor. At a presentation in 2019, SpaceX founder Elon Musk revealed his motivation in building the big rocket.
I think we should really do our very best to become a multi-planet species and to extend consciousness beyond Earth, and we should do it now.
Elon Musk is embarking on a quest, and his stainless steel Starship is his solution for colonizing the Moon, Mars, and beyond. Since this makes it a direct competitor to NASA's Space Launch System, some are asking why NASA is still bothering. SpaceX has plans for a crewed version, a cargo version, and a tanker version of the Starship. If the development of the system goes according to plan, SpaceX will have the ability to deliver roughly 100 metric tons to Earth orbit. But this will be just the first stage of the longer missions for which the Starship system has been designed. The booster will return to the ground minutes after launch, ready to be refueled, fitted with a new upper stage, and fly again within hours. Prompt on-orbit refueling of the Starship is essential for long-duration flights. This is where the methane and oxygen propellants have a clear advantage over hydrogen, often used in upper stages. Liquid methane does not need the extremely low temperatures required for liquid hydrogen. SpaceX is confident that the problems associated with long-term storage of these cryogenic propellants can be solved. For development and testing, SpaceX purchased land near Brownsville in Texas, beside Boca Chica Beach. Work here is proceeding rapidly, with prototypes being fabricated in the open air while buildings are still being planned. The Starhopper was the first flight prototype. It looked like a water tank. It flew 4 times in what was a series of tests for its single Raptor engine and the new autogenous pressurization system. Traditional designs have used helium or nitrogen to fill the increasing space within the propellant tanks as fuel and oxidizer are depleted. This system uses gaseous propellant instead, in what represents a huge weight saving. On its final flight, the Starhopper reached a high point of 150 meters, providing designers all the data they needed to modify the next prototype for a more demanding series of flights. At the end of its tests, the Starhopper was partially dismantled and its components recycled. "12 months later, the next flight article, serial number 5, made its only flight. It looked like a silo. Because of the low-speed nature of these flights, nose cones and streamlining were dispensed with. After a month, the very similar SN6 made its flight. Both prototypes were still fitted with only one engine, but they featured full-size fuel tanks and were used to refine launch procedures. The single Raptor engine was slightly off-center in the position it would occupy as part of a cluster of 3. As the frequency of the flight tests increased, crowds were drawn to Boca Chica. Because of the open nature of SpaceX's Boca Chica facility, outside observers with cameras began recording the technicians' and engineers' work, much of which was happening in the open air. While SpaceX live streams its test flights, they do not advertise and provide very little in the way of running commentary about plans. These outsiders realized there was an appetite amongst space fans for news of anything happening at Boca Chica. SN8 represented a new phase in the development of the Starship. This prototype presented the Starship's final aerodynamic profile, and space watchers were keen to see the belly flop maneuver that was such an important part of the spacecraft's re-entry to the atmosphere and its reusability. It was fitted with 3 Raptor engines. While the final Starship will have 6 engines, the 3 outer units will have larger engine bells, optimized for operation in the vacuum of space, and they will not be used for propulsive landing.
4, 3, 2, 1, ignition.
After a 24-hour delay, SN8 was launched on December 9, 2020. The test article would climb to an altitude of 12,500 meters, then adopt its side-facing re-entry profile. Without engine power, the craft was controlled by its body and nose winglets. SpaceX engineers, realizing that this was the most complex part of the return operation, were keen to perfect this new maneuver. At every point of the flight, huge volumes of data were fed back to the ground. Nobody expected the flight to be perfect. Less than 2 months later, serial number 9 was ready for flight. Sitting near the launch pad was SN10, which was being ready to take its turn. The speed at which SpaceX was building, testing, and then modifying the Starship led to comparisons with NASA's Space Launch System. The SLS had been in development for at least 10 years, and the more conventional rocket still had not flown.
3, 2, 1.
Like the previous test flights, the launch went smoothly, and the sequential shutdown of engines happened as planned. Soon after the 4-minute mark, SN9 had reached its 10-kilometer high point. It began hovering on one engine and dumping oxygen.
The LOX tank, we're beginning to flip to horizontal. And the white cloud, the plume you were seeing...
This is an important transition point for the spacecraft, not just because it flips to the horizontal, but because when the engines restart, they will draw propellant from spherical header tanks designed to deliver fuel evenly, regardless of the Starship's orientation.
The landing pad.
To deliver maximal payload, design parameters call for the craft to use as little fuel as possible during the landing sequence, and the engines must work reliably at very short notice. The freefall phase has presented no problems in any of the test flights, but flight controllers knew that reignition of the engines and transition back to the vertical was the hard part. Due to a problem with an oxygen preburner, only one engine had started, but with reduced thrust. The damaged landing pad would be repaired and improvements made to the next prototype. As a stopgap measure, SN-10 had introduced helium for pressurizing the header tanks. Like the previous test flights, engines were successfully closed down one by one, and transfer to the belly flop attitude was uneventful. As a failsafe, all three Raptor engines would ignite for the flip maneuver. A quick decision would then be made to shut down any unit that displayed problems, as only one fully functioning engine was needed for the soft landing. It bounced when it hit the ground hard. It had a slight lean, and there was a small fire at the base, but SN-10 was in one piece, and SpaceX terminated its online coverage. The helium pressurant had mixed with the fuel and reduced thrust, but it was so close to success. SN-11 flew on March 30th, 2021. It was something of an anticlimax. It took off in heavy fog, and cameras could not see it when it exploded in flight, with wreckage raining down across the launch site. A hard engine start destroyed the test article. Because all SpaceX test data is proprietary, it is difficult to know much more. In April, NASA announced that SpaceX had won the contract to build the lunar lander. It had been expected that two companies would be selected to introduce dissimilar redundancy. But with a smaller than expected allocation from Congress, cost became the major problem. A variation of the Starship that can dock with the Orion spacecraft will be developed. Several days later, the U.S. Senate's Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation convened a hearing for several presidential nominations, among them Bill Nelson as the next NASA administrator. Nelson served in the Senate for 18 years and enjoys good relations with senators from both sides of the aisle. Among his political colleagues, his appointment is not controversial, and his confirmation was regarded as a sure thing.
The timetable for 2024 is still there with the awardee. And I think we all have to recognize that space is hard, and it's an ambitious timetable, but that is what has been stated.
The 2024 moon landing date, announced under the Trump administration, was dismissed as wishful thinking because development of the NASA launcher was so far behind schedule. The $2.89 billion NASA will inject into the Starship program for a lunar landing version certainly eased the financial burden on SpaceX. So much has been committed for infrastructure for what's known as the Exploration Ground System. The historic Pad 39B, first used during the Apollo era, has been upgraded with a new flame trench and water deluge system. The three lightning towers that protect the rocket and the launch site have been extensively refurbished, and new fueling tanks have been built. The pad can now accommodate a variety of different launchers, but the mobile launch towers that feed each rocket are unique and expensive, and so far no commercial rocket builders have shown interest in the new infrastructure, leaving the Space Launch System as its only user. The crawler transporter vehicles were introduced in 1965 to take the Saturn V to the launch pad, and from 1981 to 2011, the space shuttles. These were rebuilt with one specially modified to carry the SLS. The crushed rock crawlerway was also refurbished with river rock. NASA and the US Navy have also been practicing for capsule recovery. The spacecraft will splash down in the Pacific around 100 kilometers off the coast of California. It will be met by a recovery crew from a San Antonio-class amphibious transport dock. Weighing in excess of 9,000 kilograms, the capsule is too heavy to be lifted by a helicopter. It will be hauled into the ship's docking area. Again, this is a very expensive operation. It looks primitive compared with the SpaceX plan to have its Starship land propulsively. Unlike SpaceX's Starship, NASA's Space Launch System does not have exotic means of raising funds. All cash flow into the SLS comes from the US taxpayer, and that money comes with preconditions. Development of the Space Launch System has been slow, but for mainly budgetary reasons, beyond the control of NASA. For slightly more than a year, starting in January 2020, the core stage of the SLS was undergoing tests at the Stennis Space Center in eastern Mississippi. Set in the center of woodland and with access to a navigable waterway, Stennis is one of the NASA test facilities originally built for the Apollo program. The new stage had to be validated in a series of tests known as the Green Run, where all aspects of the new hardware are exposed to conditions beyond the limits that could be expected during flight. The engines, the propellant tanks, avionics, and thrust vector controls were all tested individually and then finally working in concert. The final hot fire test had to be run twice because a problem with conservative software caused the first test to shut down prematurely. When testing was complete, the core stage was loaded onto a barge for a leisurely trip along the Pearl River to the Kennedy Space Center. Different parts of the Space Launch System began converging on the Space Center for final assembly, but the launch had continued to slip. At the same time, work on SpaceX's Starship had hit delays too. While work on the Boca Chica facility was progressing rapidly, flight testing on the heavy lift first stage could not begin. The Federal Aviation Administration was conducting an environmental review following SpaceX's plans to expand its Boca Chica site, and major testing was on hold. The area is part of the Laguna Madre hypersaline lagoon system, home to threatened or vulnerable shorebirds and turtles. Environmentalists were alarmed by the number of explosions that rained debris across the fragile region. Elon Musk said the program's delays were regulatory, not technical, and that plans for 12 launches throughout 2022 were still in place. But this launch cadence was beyond the scope of the company's original agreement with the FAA. But there was one technical problem. The Raptor engine that powers the Starship was not being produced rapidly enough to meet the program's requirements. Regarding the joint NASA-SpaceX moon landings, both organizations had lost at least 5 months due to a legal battle with Blue Origin's Jeff Bezos. The company mounted a legal challenge against NASA after its unsuccessful tender for a moon landing craft. The challenge failed, but while the case was under consideration, NASA and SpaceX were prevented from developmental work on the lunar lander. NASA conceded that this litigation, along with delays associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, would make a 2024 moon landing impossible. The agency cited a new 2025 date. NASA's Office of the Inspector General, however, made a comprehensive review of the program and stated that the development and testing of the human landing system and of the exploration spacesuits were still in the early stages, and that a lunar landing date was unlikely for several years beyond NASA's optimistic estimates. These issues should not have affected the first unmanned flight of the Space Launch System, which had been scheduled for a November 2021 launch. But clearly that did not happen, and information suggests that NASA was experiencing difficulties with the controller for one of its RS-25 engines. Despite exhaustive testing, the communication problem between the Engine 4 controller and the central computer did not show up until after the rocket had been stacked. NASA will not directly release the cost of the Orion SLS combination, but estimates of just over $1 billion per launch are regarded as modest. Launch cadence will be around 1 per year, which compares poorly to the 10 manned Apollo flights in over 4 years. With SpaceX's Starship aiming for a similar capability, it's difficult to understand why NASA and SpaceX cannot cooperate for their mutual benefit. Perhaps US politicians, who are reluctant to release funds for more than 4 Artemis missions, agree. Finally, the uncrewed Artemis 1 mission was launched on November 16, 2022.
And here we go. 10. Hydrogen burn-off igniters initiated. 7, 6, 5. 4-stage engine start. 3, 2, 1. Boosters in ignition. And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
Work continues on hardware for the Artemis 2 mission, the first to carry a crew.
All 4 RS-25 engines on the core stage and 2 solid rocket boosters. Now
with just 4 certain Artemis missions, it's impossible to see NASA achieving its stated goal of establishing a permanent base on the moon.